I'd been working the Wayne National Forest for about 3 weeks before anything happened that I couldn't explain. But I want to be honest with you. The forest felt wrong from my very first day. I don't mean wrong like dangerous, not at first. I mean wrong like walking into a room where two people have just finished arguing and they're both pretending everything is fine. That kind of wrong. The air holding something it wouldn't let go of. I drove down State Route 78 into the Ironton Ranger District on a Tuesday morning in late September. The kind of morning where the fog sits in the hollows like something poured it there. Thick and white and so low to the ground that the hilltops stick out above it like islands. Southeastern Ohio doesn't look like what most people think of when they think of Ohio. There's no flat farmland down here, no endless cornfields stretching to the horizon. This is hill country. The land folds in on itself, ridge after ridge after ridge, covered in second-growth hardwood forest that goes on for miles, without a single house or road or power line. The hollows between the ridges are deep and narrow and dark even at noon, and the creeks at the bottom of them run brown with tannins from the fallen leaves. I grew up in Chillicothe, about an hour and a half northwest of where I was heading, so I knew this part of the state. I knew it the way you know a relative you only see at holidays, familiar enough to recognize but not well enough to predict. My dad used to take me hunting in the Zaleski State Forest when I was a kid, and I remember even then feeling like the woods down here were different from the woods closer to home. Older, somehow. More patient. I became a park ranger because I couldn't stand working indoors. That's the honest truth of it. I did 4 years at Ohio University in Athens, got a degree in natural resources management, worked for 2 years at a desk job with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in Columbus, processing permits and land surveys, and every single day of those 2 years, I felt like I was suffocating. When the field position opened up in the Wayne, I applied the same day. I didn't care that it was one of the most remote postings in the state. I didn't care that the pay was barely enough to cover my student loans and the rent on a 1-bedroom apartment in Ironton. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to be in the woods. I wanted to do something that mattered. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. The ranger station for the Ironton District sits at the end of a gravel road about 4 miles off the nearest paved surface. It's a single-story concrete block building with a metal roof, built sometime in the 70s from the look of it, with a small parking area out front and a propane tank on the south side. There's a main room that serves as the office with 2 metal desks and a filing cabinet and a radio set up on a table against the back wall. Off the main room there's a small kitchen with a gas stove and a refrigerator that hums too loud, and past that a hallway with 2 bunk rooms and a bathroom with a shower that takes about 10 minutes to get hot. The front door is solid steel set in a steel frame, which I thought was overkill for a ranger station in the middle of nowhere. The windows are small and set high in the walls, more like the windows in a basement than in a house. I noticed all of this on my first day, but I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just government construction, built cheap and functional without any thought to aesthetics. Now I think about those small, high windows and that steel door differently. Dale Mercer was the senior ranger at the Ironton District. He was waiting for me when I pulled in that first morning, standing on the concrete step in front of the station with a cup of coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other, which I later learned he wasn't supposed to be smoking on duty, but nobody was going to drive 4 miles down a gravel road to check on him. Dale was in his late 50s, short and thick through the chest and shoulders, with a gray crew cut and a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same sandstone that made up the ridges around us. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he was measuring you against some standard you couldn't see, and most people came up short. He didn't shake my hand when I introduced myself. He just nodded and said, "You're the new kid from Columbus," and when I said, "Yes, sir," he said, "Don't call me sir. I work for a living," and then he turned and walked inside without waiting to see if I followed. The first thing Dale did was spread a topographic map across his desk and spend about 40 minutes walking me through my patrol area. He knew every ridge, every hollow, every creek crossing, every old logging road and abandoned home sited in the district. He'd point at a contour line on the map and say, "This is where the old Rankin place used to be. Foundation still there? Watch your step around it. Or this creek crossing floods after any rain more than half an inch. Don't try to cross it in your truck. You'll get stuck. And I'm not coming to pull you out." He was thorough and efficient, and he never once smiled. When he was done with the map, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with those measuring eyes and said the most important thing I'm going to tell you. "This forest is not like other forests." I asked him what he meant by that, and he shook his head like I'd asked a stupid question. "I mean, it's bigger than you think," he said. "Deeper than you think. People get lost in here and we don't find them. Not always. Experienced hikers, hunters who grew up in these hills, people who should know better. They go in and they don't come out, and we search for days and we don't find a body or a pack or a boot or anything." He paused and took a drink of his coffee. "So you don't go off trail without telling me where you're going and when you'll be back. You don't stay out past dark. And if something feels wrong, you trust that feeling and you come back. I want to stop for a second and tell you something about what Dale said that morning, about trusting the feeling when something is wrong. I've thought about that a lot since everything happened. Because the thing is, something felt wrong from the very beginning, from my very first patrol. Not dramatically wrong, not horror movie wrong, just slightly off, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall. You might not notice it right away, but once you do, it bothers you and you can't stop looking at it. The forest was beautiful, don't get me wrong. Late September in the Wayne is gorgeous, the maples just starting to turn, the understory still green, the light coming through the canopy in long, golden shafts. But there was something about the quality of the silence in certain hollows, the way the birds would go quiet in patches for no reason I could identify, the way I would sometimes round a bend in the trail and feel a sudden heaviness in my chest, a pressure behind my eyes, a buzzing in my ears that wasn't quite a sound but wasn't quite silence either. I wrote it off as nerves. First week jitters, like Dale would say later when I mentioned it. Your body adjusting to being alone in the woods for 8 hours a day. And maybe that's all it was, at least at first. I met Ruth Yellowbird on my 4th day. She wasn't based at our station. She worked out of the Athens Ranger District to the north, but she came down to Ironton every couple of weeks to check on some long-term wildlife monitoring sites she maintained. Camera traps and audio recorders mostly, set up in a grid pattern across a section of the forest east of our station. She pulled into the parking area around mid-morning in a Green Forest service truck that had seen better days. And when she got out, I remember thinking she moved through the space like she owned it. Not in an arrogant way. In the way that a person moves when they know exactly where everything is and exactly what everything means. Ruth was in her late 50s, lean and straight-backed with iron gray hair pulled into a braid that hung over one shoulder. Her face was angular, weathered, and her eyes were so dark they were almost black. She had a way of looking at the forest around her that I can only describe as conversational, like she was listening to something it was saying. Dale came out when he heard her truck, and the two of them exchanged a few words that I couldn't hear from where I was checking the oil in my own vehicle. Whatever Dale said made Ruth look in my direction, and she walked over and extended her hand. "Ruth Yellowbird," she said. Her grip was firm and dry. "You're the new one." "Tom Ellison," I said. "Just started Monday." She nodded, looking me over with an expression that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. More like she was taking inventory. "Your first posting?" "First field posting, yeah. I was in Columbus before this." She made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been amusement, I couldn't tell which. "Well," she said, "this is a good place to learn." She paused and then added, "as long as you're paying attention." I asked her about the monitoring sites, and she told me she'd been running them for about 6 years, tracking wildlife populations and movement patterns through the district. "Deer, turkey, coyote, black bear," she said, listing them off on her fingers. "And whatever else shows up." Something about the way she said "whatever else shows up" made me want to ask what she meant. But Dale called me over before I could, and by the time I looked back, Ruth was already heading down the trail toward her monitoring grid with a pack over one shoulder. I wouldn't see her again for almost 2 weeks, but I thought about that phrase. Whatever else shows up. There was something in her voice when she said it. Not fear exactly, more like respect. The kind of respect you give something that you know is bigger than you. The first week of patrols was quiet in terms of incidents. No poaching, no illegal campsites, no lost hikers. Just me and the forest and the slow process of learning my territory. I walked the trails and I drove the old logging roads, and I began to build a mental map of the district that went beyond what the topographic sheets could tell me. I learned which ridges had cell reception and which ones didn't. I learned where the springs were and where the old coal roads went, and which hollows got so narrow that you couldn't turn a truck around and had to back out. I learned that the forest was louder in the mornings and quieter in the afternoons, that the coyotes started calling around 9 at night and went quiet around 2 in the morning, that the barred owls in the hollow behind the station had a territory dispute going that involved a lot of aggressive hooting around midnight. Normal things, ranger things, but underneath all of it, like a bass note in a song that you feel more than hear, there was that wrongness, that pressure, that sense of being watched by something that had no eyes I could find. It was worst in the deep hollows, the ones where the ridges pressed close together and the canopy was so thick that the ground stayed damp even in dry weather. I'd be walking a creek bed, checking for erosion or illegal dumping, and I'd feel it settle over me like a weight. My chest would tighten, my vision would narrow. The hair on my arms would stand up and I'd feel this overwhelming urge to leave, to turn around and walk back the way I came as fast as I could without running. And every time, as soon as I crested the ridge and got out of the hollow, the feeling would lift like someone had taken their hand off my chest. I mentioned it to Dale after about a week, told him that certain parts of the forest gave me a bad feeling, a physical feeling, not just nervousness. He was sitting at his desk cleaning his service weapon, which he did every evening whether he'd fired it or not, and he didn't look up when he answered. "That's just the hollows," he said. "Bad air sometimes. Methane seepage from the old mines. Gets trapped down low when there's no wind." I asked him if methane could make you feel like you were being watched, and he looked up at me then with an expression I couldn't read. Could have been annoyance, could have been something else. "Kid," he said, "you spend enough time alone in the woods and your brain starts making things up to keep itself company. Don't feed it. Just do your job." So I did my job. I told myself it was bad air and new guy nerves, and I did my job, and I tried not to think about why the deer in certain parts of the forest always seemed to be moving away from something I couldn't see, or why my truck radio would sometimes pick up a low pulsing static in the deep hollows that didn't match any frequency I could identify, or why I would occasionally find patches of forest where the undergrowth was pressed flat in a circle. The grass and ferns bent over and crushed like something heavy had bedded down there. Large patches, larger than any animal bed I'd ever seen. It was October 9th when I found the first real evidence that something was wrong. I remember the date because I wrote it in my field notebook, and later had to explain to a lot of people why I hadn't reported it immediately over the radio. The answer is that I didn't know what to report. I was patrolling the southern edge of my territory, an area where the forest runs up against an old strip mine that's been partially reclaimed. The leaves were at full color, reds and oranges so bright they almost hurt to look at, and the air had that October crispness that makes you feel alert and alive. I was following a game trail along a ridgetop when I smelled it. You know how roadkill smells after a few days in summer. That heavy, sweet, gagging smell that gets into your throat and stays there. This was like that, but worse, thicker, like the smell had weight to it. I followed it down off the ridge into a hollow that I hadn't explored before, a narrow cut between 2 sandstone outcrops where the creek ran thin and brown over a bed of shale. The smell got stronger as I descended, strong enough that I had to breathe through my mouth, and when I reached the creek bottom, I found the source. It was a deer. Or it had been. The carcass was laid out across a flat rock in the middle of the creek bed, positioned in a way that didn't look like it had fallen there or been dragged there by a predator. It looked placed, deliberately. The rib cage was torn open and the organs were gone, all of them, and the flesh had been stripped from the bones in long, clean strips. Not torn, stripped, like someone had taken a fillet knife and methodically removed every piece of meat from the bone. The hide was pulled back and folded, actually folded along the spine. And the head was wrong. It had been twisted around on the neck so that it faced backward, the dead eyes staring up at the ridge I'd just come down from. I stood there for a long time. My brain was trying to make this fit into a category it understood. A bear kill, a coyote scavenge, a sick joke by poachers trying to scare rangers off their territory. But none of those explanations fit what I was looking at, the precision of it, the deliberateness, the way the head had been turned. No animal does that, and no human I want to share a forest with does that either. I took photographs with my field camera and I marked the GPS coordinates in my notebook, and then I looked at the ground around the rock, and that's when my stomach dropped. There were tracks in the soft mud along the creek bank. They were shaped like a human footprint, but they were wrong in every proportion. Too long, too wide. The toes were elongated and spread apart in a way that human toes don't spread, and they pressed deep into the mud, deeper than my boot prints, which meant whatever made them was heavy, much heavier than me. And the stride. The distance between tracks was enormous, 6 feet or more between steps, which meant whatever made them was either very tall or moving very fast. I measured one of the prints with my hand for scale. It was at least 18 inches long. I took more photographs, and then I stood up and I listened. The hollow was silent, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no water sound, even though the creek was running right in front of me. Just that heavy, pressing silence and the smell of death and something underneath the death smell. Something musky and rank, like an animal, but not like any animal I'd ever smelled. And then I felt it, that pressure, that tightening in my chest, but stronger than before, much stronger, and accompanied by something new, a vibration. Not a sound exactly, but a physical sensation in my sternum, like standing too close to a subwoofer. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, and with each pulse the dread got worse, ratcheting up from unease to anxiety to something approaching panic. Every cell in my body was telling me to leave, to go up, to get out of that hollow. So I did. I turned around and I walked back up the ridge as fast as I could without running, and with every step up, the feeling lessened slightly, like climbing out of cold water. By the time I reached the ridge top, I could breathe normally again, but my hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. When I got back to the station that evening, I showed Dale the photographs on my camera. He looked through them slowly, his face unreadable. And when he got to the picture of the tracks, he paused for a long time. Then he set the camera down on the desk and said, "It's probably a bear. They can do strange things to a carcass." "That's not a bear track," I said. Dale looked at me, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked like recognition. Then it was gone and his face was closed off again. "Look," he said, "I've been doing this a long time. The forest is full of things that look strange if you don't know what you're looking at. Could be a bear, could be a hiker in weird shoes messing around, could be anything. Don't go building a monster out of mud prints." He handed the camera back to me. "Write up the carcass as a probable predator kill and file it. Don't go back to that hollow alone." The last part he said casually, like an afterthought, but his eyes were hard when he said it, and he held my gaze until I nodded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest outside and thinking about those tracks and that carcass and the way the head had been turned backward on the neck. I thought about the stripped flesh, so precise, so deliberate. I thought about that vibration in my chest and the way the dread had intensified with it, like the two things were connected, like the feeling wasn't coming from inside me, like it was being done to me. Around midnight, I got up to get water from the kitchen, and I found Dale sitting at his desk in the dark. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't reading or cleaning his weapon or looking at maps. He was just sitting there in the dark, facing the front door, his service weapon on the desk in front of him. He didn't say anything when I came in, and I didn't say anything to him. I got my water and went back to bed. But I noticed that he stayed there all night. I could hear his chair creak occasionally through the wall, a small sound in the darkness, and I lay there listening to it until dawn came gray and cold through the small high window above my bunk. Ruth came back 11 days later. It was a Tuesday, October 20th, and the weather had turned. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and a cold rain was falling. The kind of rain that Ohio does better than anywhere, steady and gray and relentless, turning the world into shades of brown and charcoal. She came into the station shaking water off her rain jacket and went straight to the coffee maker without greeting either of us, which I was learning was normal for her. She poured herself a cup and then turned to Dale and said, "3 of my cameras are down." Dale grunted. "Batteries?" "No," she said. "Destroyed. Something tore them off the trees. The housings are smashed." Dale's hand paused midway to his coffee cup just for a second, and then continued the motion like nothing had happened. "Probably a bear," he said. "They do that sometimes." Ruth set her cup down on the counter and looked at him with those dark eyes and didn't say anything for a long time. The silence between them felt like a conversation I wasn't invited to. Finally, she turned to me. "You're Tom, right? The new one?" I nodded. "Come with me tomorrow morning," she said. "I want to show you something." We left at first light. The rain had stopped overnight, but the forest was still dripping, every leaf and branch shedding water, and the fog was so thick in the hollows that we couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. Ruth moved through the forest with a confidence that I envied, navigating without a map or GPS, following landmarks that I couldn't identify. We hiked for about an hour, mostly in silence, before she stopped at the base of a large white oak and pointed. I looked up and saw the remnants of what had been a trail camera. The housing was black plastic, or had been. Now it was in pieces, scattered across the leaf litter at the base of the tree. The mounting bracket was still attached to the trunk, but it was bent almost flat, the bolts twisted and the bark torn away in long gouges. I looked at the gouges more closely. They were deep, 5 parallel marks raked downward through the bark and into the wood beneath. I looked at Ruth. She was watching me with that inventory-taking expression, like she was waiting to see what I would do with what I was seeing. 5 marks, I said. She nodded. "A bear has 5 claws," I said, trying to make it fit. She nodded again. "But those are too far apart," I said. "A bear's claws aren't spread that wide." "No," she said, "they're not." She walked me to the other 2 destroyed cameras. Same thing at each site. Housings destroyed, mounting brackets torn off or bent flat, and those 5 parallel gouges in the bark. At the 3rd site, in the soft mud at the base of the tree, I found another track, the same kind I'd found at the creek bed, 18 inches long, impossibly deep, with those elongated spread toes. Ruth stood behind me as I crouched over it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I stood up and turned to face her. "What is this?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the canopy, at the gray sky showing through the bare branches. And then she looked back at me with an expression that was absolutely calm and absolutely serious. "Have you been feeling it?" she asked. "The pressure, in the hollows." I stared at her. "Yes," I said. "How did you know?" "Because that's how it starts," she said. "It puts out a sound, below what you can hear. But your body feels it, makes you scared, makes you want to leave. That's how you know it's close. That's how you know it's watching." I asked her what it was, and she started walking back toward the station, moving at a steady pace through the fog. She talked as she walked, not looking at me, her voice flat and practical like she was giving a report. She said her grandmother's family had lived in these hills before the forest was established, back when the government came in during the Depression and bought up all the land and moved the families out and planted the trees over what had been farms and homesteads and communities. She said her grandmother talked about something that lived in the deep hollows, something that had been there before her family, before anyone. She said the Adena people knew about it, the Hopewell people knew about it. She said you could see it in the way they built their earthworks, always on the high ground, always facing the hollows, always with clear sight lines into the low places. She said the hill country families had known about it too, had built their entire way of life around avoiding it without ever naming it directly. You didn't go into certain hollows after dark. You didn't camp in certain places. You didn't follow sounds you heard at night that you couldn't explain. And if you felt that pressure, that dread, you left immediately, and you didn't look back. She said the Forest Service started getting reports in the 1960s. Hunters and hikers and campers who came back with stories of something large moving through the trees, something that walked on two legs, something that built nests out of grass and brush. They called it the grassman, she said. That's what the reports say. The Ohio grassman, like it's just some kind of ape, some kind of animal. She stopped walking and turned to face me. We were on a ridgetop now, above the fog, and the weak October sun was trying to break through the clouds. She looked at me, and her expression was the most serious I had ever seen on another human being. "It's not an animal," she said. "I don't know what it is. My grandmother didn't know what it was. The old people didn't know what it was. But it's been in these hills longer than anything human, and it's not an animal. An animal doesn't turn a deer's head around to face the direction it came from. An animal doesn't destroy cameras that are watching it. An animal doesn't make that sound that gets inside your chest and makes you run." I felt cold, not from the weather, from something deeper. I asked her what it wanted. She shook her head. "I don't think it wants anything the way we want things," she said. "I think it's territorial. I think it lets people know when they're too close. And I think when people don't listen." She didn't finish the sentence. We walked the rest of the way back to the station in silence. When we got there, Dale was sitting on the steps smoking a cigarette, and he looked at Ruth and then at me, and he said, "Don't tell me. I don't want to hear it." Ruth walked past him without a word. She got in her truck and she left, and Dale and I stood there in the cold gray afternoon and didn't talk about any of it. But that night, he sat at his desk in the dark again, facing the door with his weapon on the desk. And this time, I sat up with him. We didn't talk. We just sat there and listened to the forest being quiet in a way that forests shouldn't be quiet. 5 days later, I heard the voice. I was alone. It was the 25th of October, and Dale had driven into Ironton for supplies, a 2-hour round trip that left me solo at the station. I decided to do a short patrol of the immediate area, just the trail system within a mile of the station, something I'd done a dozen times before without incident. It was mid-afternoon, overcast but dry, temperature in the mid-40s. I walked the loop trail that circles the ridge behind the station, a well-maintained path with orange blazes on the trees every 50 feet. Normal. Routine. I was about 3/4 of the way around the loop when I felt it, the pressure. Sudden and intense, like someone had turned a dial from 0 to 8 in an instant. My chest tightened, my ears buzzed, and the forest went silent. Not quiet, silent, like someone had pressed mute on the world. I stopped walking. My hand went to the radio on my belt, and then I heard it. Tom, my name, called from somewhere off the trail to my left, down in the hollow. A man's voice, familiar but not quite right, like hearing a recording of someone you know, close enough to recognize but missing something essential. "Tom, over here." It sounded like Dale. It sounded almost exactly like Dale. But Dale was in Ironton. I had watched him drive away 2 hours ago. His truck was not in the parking area. He was not in the forest. He could not be calling my name from the bottom of a hollow to my left. "Tom, come down here. I need your help." I stood frozen on the trail. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct I had was split in two. Half of me wanted to go toward the voice because it sounded like someone I knew, and they sounded like they needed help. The other half of me was remembering Ruth's voice, flat and practical, saying that when people don't listen, and not finishing the sentence. I did not go toward the voice. I unclipped my radio and I keyed it. And I said, "Dale, what's your 20? And there was a pause, and then Dale's voice came back through the radio, the real Dale, clear and slightly annoyed. "I'm on 93 north of Ironton, 20 minutes out. What do you need?" I didn't answer him. I clipped the radio back to my belt, and I stood there on the trail with my heart pounding and the pressure in my chest building, and that voice still calling from the hollow. "Tom, Tom, come help me! Tom!" And I turned around, and I walked back toward the station. I did not run. I wanted to run. Every cell in my body wanted to run. But something Ruth had said came back to me. Something she'd mentioned almost offhand on our walk back. She'd said my grandmother said you don't run from it because running is what prey does. So I walked. Fast, but I walked. And behind me, from the hollow, the voice changed. It stopped being Dale's voice, and it became something else. A sound I cannot describe to you adequately. A low droning call that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. And the pressure in my chest peaked so hard that my vision went gray at the edges, and I thought for a moment that I was going to pass out. But I kept walking and I reached the station, and I went inside and I closed that steel door and I locked it. And I sat down at Dale's desk and I shook. I shook for 20 minutes straight. When Dale got back, I was still sitting there. He took one look at me and he didn't ask what happened. He just put the groceries away and made coffee and sat down across from me, and after a long time he said it called you, didn't it? I nodded. He closed his eyes and let out a breath through his nose. Yeah, he said. It called me too, about 3 years ago. I never told anyone. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was no hardness in his expression, just exhaustion. And beneath the exhaustion, fear? What do we do? I asked. Dale shook his head slowly. I don't know, kid. I've been trying not to think about that for 3 years. The next morning, Ruth's truck pulled into the lot before sunrise. I don't know if Dale called her or if she just knew, the way she seemed to know things about this forest that the rest of us had to learn the hard way. She came inside without knocking, rain still dripping from her jacket even though it wasn't raining, like she'd walked through the fog so thick it soaked her on the drive in. She poured herself coffee and sat down at the table across from me and Dale, and she said, "Tell me everything." So I told her. I told her about the voice, about how it sounded like Dale but wrong, about the pressure in my chest and the silence and the way it had changed into that droning sound when I wouldn't come toward it. She listened without interrupting, her dark eyes fixed on my face, and when I was done, she nodded once like I had confirmed something she already suspected. Then she looked at Dale. He was staring into his coffee cup, his jaw tight. "You heard it too," she said. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, Dale said without looking up. I was checking a fence line on the eastern boundary. It called me with my ex-wife's voice. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Funny thing is, she's been dead for 6 years. Cancer. So I knew right away it wasn't her. But God help me. For a second I wanted to go toward it anyway, just to hear her voice again. The room was quiet for a long moment. The coffee maker gurgled. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was seeping through the small windows. Finally, Ruth spoke, and her voice was the same flat, practical tone she always used, but there was an urgency underneath it that I hadn't heard before. "It's escalating," she said. "In 6 years of running my cameras, I've lost equipment maybe 4 times. All 4 were in the last 3 months. The carcasses? Those started in August. Dale, you heard the voice 3 years ago, and nothing happened after. Now it's calling Tom after 3 weeks. Something's changed." Dale finally looked up. "What do you think changed?" he asked. Ruth's eyes flicked to me and then back to Dale. "New person," she said. "New presence in its territory. It's testing him, seeing what he'll do, seeing if he'll come when it calls." I felt my stomach drop. "So what happens when it figures out I won't come?" I asked. Ruth didn't answer right away. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table, and I watched something move across her face, a calculation, a weighing of options. When she looked up, her expression was set in a way that told me she'd made a decision. "My grandmother told me a story once," she said, "about her uncle. His name was Everett. He lived in a cabin in Pine Hollow, about 4 miles southeast of here, back before the forest was established. He was a hunter and a trapper, and he'd lived in that hollow his whole life. One spring, the thing started calling him, used his daughter's voice, his daughter who died of influenza the winter before. He didn't go toward it. He was smart enough not to go toward it, but he didn't leave either." She paused. After about 2 weeks of the calling, it stopped using the voice, and it came to his cabin. Dale shifted in his chair, the metal creaking. Ruth continued in that same level tone. He survived the night, barely. He boarded up the windows and he kept a fire going in the hearth all night, and it circled the cabin until dawn, and then it left. The next night it came back, and the next night, and the next. She looked at me directly. On the 5th night it got in. They found what was left of him a week later when his neighbor came to check on him. I felt cold all over. My hands were flat on the table, and I could see them trembling slightly. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying we have a window," Ruth said. "Maybe a week, maybe 2 before it stops testing and starts hunting. We can use that window to leave, or we can use it to do something about this." Dale's head snapped up. "Do something? What exactly are you proposing, Ruth?" She looked at him steadily. "My grandmother also told me what Everett's brother did after they found him. He spent 3 months preparing. He dug a pit in the hollow where the thing had been seen, lined it with clay from the creek bank, packed it with green wood and tinder. He staked a deer carcass above it, fresh killed, still bleeding, and he waited on the ridge with a torch and a can of kerosene." Dale stared at her. "And?" "It worked," Ruth said. "The thing came for the carcass. It fell into the pit. He lit the fire and it burned for 2 days. The hollow was black for years after. Saplings are just now growing back in that spot, 80 years later." Dale leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You're talking about digging a pit in the middle of a national forest and setting a fire in it. In October, when everything's dry and covered in leaves. You want to start a forest fire." Ruth's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about surviving," she said. "I'm talking about the fact that in 6 years, this thing has never been this active, and now it's calling your new ranger by name after 3 weeks, and if we don't do something, it's going to come here, to this station." She let that sit. Dale looked at the steel door. He looked at the small, high windows, and I saw him thinking what I had been thinking since my first day. Those weren't designed to keep weather out. They were designed to keep something from getting in, and they might not be enough. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life. We planned, we argued. We drove into Ironton for supplies and told no one what we were buying or why. Dale was resistant at first, kept saying we should just report it, call in more rangers, let someone else handle it. But Ruth shut that down with a single question. "What are you going to report, Dale? That a Bigfoot is hunting your new ranger? You want to tell the district supervisor that? You want to be the guy who files that report?" Dale didn't bring it up again. Ruth chose the location. There was a narrow hollow about 2 miles southwest of the station, a place where 2 ridges pinched together and the creek ran through a gap barely 20 feet wide. The walls of the hollow were steep sandstone, almost vertical on both sides, and the bottom was flat clay. It was a natural bottleneck. If something was moving through that hollow, it would have to pass through that narrow point. There was no way around it unless you went up and over the ridge, which Ruth said the thing wouldn't do if it was focused on prey. "It goes straight toward what it wants," she said. "It doesn't go around." We dug the pit over 2 days. It was back-breaking work. The clay was dense and heavy, and we were digging in a space barely 15 feet across. We made it 8 feet deep and about 10 feet long, wide enough that nothing could jump across it in the narrow confines of the hollow. We lined the bottom with green wood, layers of it, interspersed with dry tinder and dead leaves. Ruth brought 5 gallons of kerosene from her truck, and we soaked the bottom layer until the clay was dark with it. The plan was simple in concept. We would stake a fresh deer carcass on the far side of the pit, visible from the hollow entrance. I would be the one in the hollow near the carcass, because I was the one the thing was focused on. Ruth and Dale would be on the ridges above, one on each side, with kerosene and road flares. When the thing entered the hollow and moved toward me, toward the carcass, it would have to cross the pit. The covering we built, woven branches and leaves over a framework of thin saplings, would hold the weight of a deer or a person, but nothing heavier. When it fell through, Ruth and Dale would light their flares and throw them down. The kerosene would catch. The green wood would burn hot and slow. and whatever was in the pit would burn with it. I would run, back up the hollow, away from the pit, toward the station. I didn't ask what would happen if it didn't fall through. I didn't ask what would happen if it was faster than we thought, or smarter than we thought, or if it came from a direction we didn't expect. I didn't ask because I could see in Ruth's face that she had already considered all of those possibilities and decided to go forward anyway. That told me everything I needed to know about how dangerous she believed doing nothing would be. We set the trap on October 29th. Dale shot a deer that morning, a young doe, clean kill. We dressed it on site and hauled it down into the hollow and staked it on the far side of the pit with its belly open so the blood and scent would carry. Then we took our positions, me at the bottom, about 30 feet past the pit, crouched behind a sandstone outcrop with a clear line of sight to the pit covering. Ruth on the eastern ridge. 70 feet up, with a road flare and a jug of kerosene. Dale on the western ridge, same height, same equipment. We were in position by 4 in the afternoon. The sun set at 6:32. We waited. The first 2 hours of dark were the hardest. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. The waiting was its own kind of torture. I crouched behind my rock and I listened to the hollow, and the hollow was silent. Not the normal silence of a forest at night, which is actually full of sound if you know how to hear it. This was the dead silence, the mute button silence, the silence that meant the thing was close. I could feel the pressure in my chest, faint at first, then building slowly, that low, thrumming vibration that lived below the threshold of hearing. My breath fogged in the cold air and my muscles ached from holding still, and the deer carcass was a dark shape in front of me, its blood smell thick and metallic in the damp, hollow air. I couldn't see Ruth or Dale on the ridges above. I couldn't hear them. I was alone at the bottom of a pit-trapped hollow with a dead animal and the growing certainty that something was coming. At 8:47, I know this because I checked my watch compulsively every few minutes. The pressure in my chest doubled, like someone had put their hands on my rib cage and squeezed. My vision pulsed at the edges, and I tasted copper on my tongue. And then I heard the footsteps. They came from the south end of the hollow, from deeper in the forest, slow and deliberate. Heavy. Each one a distinct impact that I felt through the ground as much as heard through the air. Slow, rhythmic, patient. Not the footsteps of something that was stalking, the footsteps of something that knew where it was going and was not in any hurry to get there. I pressed myself against the rock and I held my breath and I watched the darkness at the south end of the hollow. And then I saw it. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've gone over it in my mind 1,000 times since that night, and I'm still not sure I trust what I saw. The darkness at the end of the hollow seemed to thicken, to coalesce, and then something moved forward out of it. It was tall, that's the first thing, tall in a way that made my brain reject what my eyes were seeing. 8 feet, maybe 9. The proportions were wrong for a human, but wrong for an animal too. Limbs too long, torso too wide, head set forward on the neck in a way that suggested enormous weight. It moved on 2 legs with a rolling gait that covered ground faster than the slow rhythm of its footsteps should have allowed. And it was dark, not just unlit, but dark like it absorbed the faint ambient light rather than reflecting it. The only features I could make out were the shoulders, impossibly broad, and the suggestion of arms that hung past its knees, and something about the head, a flatness, a width that was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The smell hit me next, rank, overwhelming, like rotting meat and musk and something else underneath, something chemical, something that burned my sinuses. And the pressure, God, the pressure. It was so intense now that I couldn't breathe properly. My chest was being compressed by something invisible, and the dread, the pure animal terror, was so overwhelming that I nearly stood up and ran. That's what it wanted, I think. It wanted me to run. It wanted the chase. But I didn't. I stayed behind my rock and I bit down on my own hand until I tasted blood. And I watched the thing move up the hollow toward the deer carcass and toward the pit. It moved with absolute confidence, no hesitation, No scanning of the ground or the ridges. It went straight toward the carcass like a train on a track, 20 feet from the pit. 15, 10. I saw the covering flex slightly as it stepped onto the edge of it, the thin saplings bowing under a weight that must have been enormous. And then it was over the center of the pit, and the covering gave way. The sound was enormous in the silence of the hollow. Cracking wood and tearing brush, and a sound from the thing itself. Not a scream, not a roar, something between the two. A bellow of shock and rage that hit me like a physical force. I heard Ruth shout from the eastern ridge now, and I saw the spark of a road flare ignite orange against the darkness, and then a second one from Dale's side, and both arced down into the pit trailing smoke and fire. The kerosene caught with a whump that I felt in my chest, and suddenly the hollow was full of light, orange and red and blazing, and the heat washed over me like opening an oven door. I stood up from behind my rock. I should have run. That was the plan. I was supposed to run the moment the flares went in, but I couldn't move. I was looking at the pit. The thing was in the pit. It was in the fire, the flames climbing its body, and it was thrashing, slamming against the clay walls with a force that sent chunks of earth flying. And in the firelight I could see it. I could see it clearly for the first and only time. Its skin was gray-brown, the color of dead bark, and it was covered in matted dark hair that was now catching fire and curling and blackening. Its face, God, its face was flat and broad, with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes that reflected the fire like a cat's eyes reflect headlights. Its mouth was open, screaming that terrible bellow, and the mouth was too wide and full of teeth that were flat and square, like a human's. But too many of them, too many rows. And its arms were reaching up, reaching for the edge of the pit, and the arms were long enough to reach. It was pulling itself up, out of the fire. It was on fire, and it was pulling itself out. Ruth screamed from the ridge, pour it now!" I heard the sound of kerosene splashing, saw the gush of liquid fire as she dumped her entire jug into the pit. The flames roared higher, and the thing fell back, thrashing and bellowing. But on the other side of the hollow, on the western ridge, there was silence. "Dale!" Ruth screamed. "Dale, light it!" Nothing. I looked up at the western ridge, and in the flickering light of the pit fire I could see Dale. He was standing at the edge, silhouetted against the sky, motionless. The road flare was in his hand, unlit. The kerosene jug was at his feet. He wasn't moving. He was staring down into the pit at the burning thing, and he was not moving. "Dale!" I screamed. "Do it!" He didn't respond. And then the thing in the pit turned its burning face upward, and it opened its mouth, and it said Dale's name, in Dale's own voice. Dale. And Dale moved. But not to light the flare. He stepped forward, toward the edge, like he was going to step off the ridge and drop into the pit. Like he was answering a call. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. Dale took one more step, and the sandstone edge of the ridge crumbled under his foot, and he fell. He didn't fall into the pit. He fell short, hitting the steep clay wall of the hollow about halfway down, and he tumbled and slid the rest of the way to the bottom in a cascade of loose earth and rock. He landed maybe 10 feet from the pit edge. He wasn't moving. The thing was still in the fire, but it was still alive. The flames were lower now, the initial burst of kerosene burning down, and it was struggling upward again, those impossibly long arms reaching for the edge. And it was looking at Dale's motionless body 10 feet from the edge of the pit. Ruth was scrambling down the eastern ridge, half sliding, half falling, shouting something I couldn't hear over the sound of the fire and the things bellowing. I didn't think. I ran forward, not away from the hollow like the plan said, toward Dale. I grabbed him under the arms and I pulled. He was dead weight, unconscious or worse, and he was heavy. 200 pounds of man in a canvas jacket, and I pulled with everything I had. The thing's hand appeared over the edge of the pit. Gray-brown fingers, each one as long as my forearm, curling over the clay lip, gripping, pulling. I heaved Dale backward, dragging him across the clay floor of the hollow, my boots slipping on the wet ground. Ruth reached the bottom of the hollow, and she had a flare, lit and sputtering red, and she ran toward the pit and she threw it directly at the hand gripping the edge. The flare hit the thing's fingers and bounced into the pit, and the kerosene-soaked wood below caught again with a fresh surge of heat and light. The hand jerked back. The thing bellowed again and fell back into the fire, and I kept pulling Dale, pulling him backward up the hollow, my arms screaming, my lungs burning, my legs driving against the clay. Ruth was beside me now, grabbing Dale's jacket, helping me haul him. We dragged him 50 feet, 100 feet, up the slope of the hollow away from the pit. Behind us, the fire was dying again, the green wood burning down to embers, and the sounds from the pit were changing. Less bellowing, more of that low, droning sound that I felt in my chest, like it was gathering itself, like it was getting ready. "We have to go," Ruth said. "Now! Can we carry him?" I gasped. Ruth looked at Dale. His face was gray in the fading firelight. There was blood in his hair where his head had hit rock on the way down. His breathing was shallow and fast. She knelt and felt his neck, his ribs, his legs. "Ribs broken at least," she said. "Maybe his neck. If we move him wrong, we could kill him." Behind us, from the pit, came the sound of clay crumbling, of something large pulling itself upward. Ruth closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, her face was absolutely calm and absolutely certain. "Go," she said to me. "Get to the station. Get on the radio. Get help here now. I'm staying with him." "I can't leave you," I said. "Tom!" Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "That thing is getting out of that pit in about 2 minutes. If you're here when it does, we all die. If you get to the station, you can call for help and at least one of us might make it. Go, now." I went. God forgive me, I went. I turned and I ran up the hollow, away from the fading fire and the sound of the thing climbing out of its trap. And I ran faster than I have ever run in my life. The ridges blurred past me in the darkness, the branches whipping my face and arms, my boots pounding the ground. Behind me, I heard Ruth's voice, calm and clear in the night air, saying something that I couldn't make out. And then I heard the thing bellow, not from the pit anymore, but from above it, from the hollow floor. And I heard Ruth's voice again, louder this time, and I recognized what she was saying. She was singing, an old song in a language I didn't know. And then the bellowing drowned it out, and I couldn't hear her anymore. And I ran and I ran and I ran. I don't remember reaching the station. I remember the hollow and I remember running, and then I was inside. The steel door slammed behind me, the lock thrown, and I was on the floor in front of the radio trying to make my hands work. They were shaking so badly that I knocked the handset off the desk twice before I could grip it. I keyed the radio and my voice came out broken, barely words. "This is Ranger Ellison, Ironton District, requesting immediate emergency assistance. 2 rangers down. I need medical, and I need people. I need people out here now. Please, there's something in the forest. Please send help." The dispatcher's voice came back calm and professional. "Copy, Ironton. Say again your situation. How many injured? What is the nature of the emergency?" I tried to explain. I could hear how I sounded, panicked, incoherent. A man coming apart at the seams. I said animal attack. I said 2 rangers injured, possibly dead. I said I needed helicopter evacuation, and I needed it now. The dispatcher said help was being mobilized. ETA approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes. I sat on the floor with the handset in my lap and the number, 90 pounding in my head like a heartbeat. 90 minutes! Ruth and Dale were 2 miles away in that hollow with that thing out of its pit and burning and enraged, and 90 minutes might as well have been 90 years. And then I heard it, outside the station. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, coming up the gravel road toward the front door. "No," I whispered. The footsteps stopped, right outside. I could feel the pressure immediately, so intense that my vision went white at the edges. The vibration in my chest was almost painful, like my heart was being squeezed by an invisible hand. And then the voice came. "Tom, open the door." It was Ruth's voice, calm and even and exactly right. "Tom, I'm hurt. Open the door. Let me in." Tears ran down my face and I didn't wipe them away. I sat on the floor with the rifle across my knees, and I didn't move and I didn't speak. The voice continued, "Tom, please, I'm bleeding. I need help. Open the door." It used Ruth's voice for a long time, minutes. Then it switched to Dale's. Then, and this is the part that almost broke me, it used my mother's voice. My mother, who was alive and well in Chillicothe, 70 miles away, sleeping in her bed and knowing nothing about what was happening to her son. "Tommy," it said in her voice. "Tommy, honey, let me in. It's cold out here. Please, baby, let me in." I put my hands over my ears and I pressed my face to my knees and I screamed. I screamed to drown it out because if I listened any longer, I was going to open that door. I screamed until my throat was raw, and then I stopped and listened, and the voice had stopped too. But the pressure hadn't. If anything, it was stronger. And then came the first impact on the door. The steel door rang like a bell. The entire frame shuddered, and dust fell from the ceiling tiles. And the sound was so enormous in that small concrete room that it felt like the building itself had flinched. I scrambled backward across the floor, the rifle clattering against the linoleum, my back hitting the far wall next to the radio desk. The second impact came less than 3 seconds later. The door bowed inward, just slightly, the steel flexing in a way that steel should not flex, and I saw the frame shift in the concrete block wall. Hairline cracks appeared in the mortar around the top hinge. A third impact. The overhead light flickered and went out. The only illumination was the small battery-powered emergency light mounted above the back hallway, casting everything in a weak yellow glow. I could see the door clearly from where I sat, and I could see it moving with each blow, pulsing inward like the chest of something breathing. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the pounding. I sat in the dim yellow light with a rifle aimed at the door, and I listened and I heard nothing. Not the footsteps moving away, not the wind, not the forest, nothing. Just the hum of the emergency light and my own ragged breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I counted to 60 in my head, then 60 again. Nothing. Maybe it left. Maybe the fire had wounded it enough. Maybe it was giving up. And then the scratching started. Not at the door, at the south wall. The exterior of the south wall was concrete block, 8 inches thick, and something was dragging across it, not clawing at it, dragging, slowly, like a hand running along the surface, feeling for weakness, testing. The sound moved. It traveled along the south wall from east to west, reached the corner, and then continued along the west wall. It was circling the building. I tracked the sound with my eyes, turning my head to follow it as it moved along the west wall, reached the northwest corner, and continued along the north wall. The north wall was where the kitchen was. The north wall was where the propane tank was connected from outside. The scratching paused at a point that I knew with absolute certainty was directly behind the propane hookup. Then it continued, along the north wall to the northeast corner and back along the east wall. The east wall had the bunkroom windows, the small, high windows. I heard a different sound from that direction, a creaking, like pressure being applied to something designed not to flex. The window frame. I was on my feet and moving before I consciously decided to move, stumbling down the hallway toward the bunkroom. In the weak light, I could see the window on the far wall, a rectangle of darkness barely 18 inches tall and 30 inches wide, set 6 feet up in the wall. The glass was intact, but the aluminum frame around it was bending inward. Something was pressing against it from outside, not hitting it, pressing steadily. I could see the frame deforming, the screws that held it to the concrete block pulling free millimeter by millimeter. I raised the rifle and aimed at the window. My hands were shaking so badly that the barrel waved in circles, but I aimed as best I could and I waited. The frame gave another half inch. The caulking around the glass cracked and a sliver of cold air pushed through. And with the air came the smell. That rank, overwhelming, chemical rot smell that I had learned to associate with the thing's presence. It was right there, right on the other side of that thin glass and failing frame, inches away. I could feel the pressure in my chest like a vice. My vision was tunneling. My legs wanted to buckle. and the glass cracked. Just a single line running diagonally from corner to corner, but the sound of it in that quiet room was like a gunshot. I fired. I didn't aim properly, I just squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, and the bullet punched through the cracked glass and into whatever was on the other side. The glass shattered outward, and cold air flooded in, and from outside came that bellow, that deep-chested roar that shook the walls, and then the pressure on the frame released all at once. I heard footsteps, fast, moving away from the wall, and then that droning sound, that subsonic pulse that I felt in my marrow, rising in intensity until my nose started bleeding, a single thin stream running over my lip and dripping from my chin. Then it faded. The footsteps faded. The pressure faded, and the silence came back, but a different silence this time. Not the dead-mute silence of the thing's presence, the normal silence of a forest at night in late October, full of small sounds, a distant owl, the creek running behind the station, the faint whisper of wind in bare branches. I didn't move from the bunk room doorway for a long time. I stood there with a rifle aimed at the broken window, blood drying on my face, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. Eventually, I made myself move. I went to the kitchen and got a trash bag and duct tape, and I covered the broken window as best I could, my hands fumbling with the tape, ears straining for any sound from outside. Then I went back to the main room, and I sat down with my back against the radio desk and the rifle across my knees, and I waited. The helicopter arrived at 12:17 in the morning. I know because I was staring at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes pass one by one, each one an individual act of survival. When I heard the rotors in the distance, I almost didn't believe it. The sound grew louder, became a roar, and then spotlights swept across the windows, and the gravel parking area outside was lit up white as day. I heard voices, real voices, human voices shouting over the helicopter noise. "Ranger Ellison, are you inside? Can you hear us?" I stood up and my legs almost gave out. I walked to the steel door and I put my hand on the lock, and I hesitated. Because the last time I'd heard voices outside this door, they hadn't been real. But these came with the helicopter. These came with the lights and the rotors and the sound of boots on gravel, multiple sets of boots and radio chatter, and the normal busy noise of an emergency response. I opened the door. The light hit me like a wall, and I squinted against it, one hand raised to shield my eyes. 2 men in tactical gear were on the step, weapons drawn. Behind them, I could see the helicopter on the gravel lot, its rotors still spinning, and beyond that, 2 trucks with their headlights on and more people moving in the lights, setting up equipment, shouting to each other. One of the men on the step, a state wildlife officer whose name I never learned, took one look at me and said, "Jesus Christ." It must have looked bad. Blood on my face from the nosebleed. Blood on my hands from where I'd cut myself on the broken window glass. My clothes soaked with sweat and mud, and probably more blood that wasn't mine, from dragging Dale through the hollow hours earlier. My eyes wild and my body shaking, and the rifle still clutched in my hands like I'd forgotten it was there. They took the rifle from me. They sat me down on the step. Someone put a blanket around my shoulders, and someone else shone a light in my eyes and asked me questions, my name, what day it was, how many fingers they were holding up. I answered mechanically while another part of my brain was trying to form words for what I needed to tell them. "There are 2 rangers out there," I said. My voice sounded like someone had rubbed it with sandpaper in a hollow about 2 miles southwest. "They're hurt. One of them might be dead. Please, you have to go get them." They asked me what had happened, what kind of animal attack, how large, how many animals. I said I didn't know. I said big. I said please go get them. They mobilized a ground team, 6 officers with rifles and lights and medical equipment, heading into the forest on foot. I watched them go, their flashlight beams bobbing between the trees, getting smaller, and I felt a terror so acute it was almost paralyzing. Because I knew what was out there, and they didn't, and I hadn't been able to explain it to them in any way that would prepare them for what they might find. They were gone for 2 hours. I sat on the step wrapped in the blanket, refusing to go back inside. refusing the paramedic's suggestion that I get in the ambulance that had arrived while the ground team was out. I couldn't be inside. I couldn't be enclosed again. The sky was better. The helicopter lights were better. The presence of other people was better. When the ground team came back, I knew from their faces before they said anything. They found Dale first. He was in the hollow where I had left him, where Ruth had stayed with him. He was alive, barely. Broken ribs, broken collarbone, severe concussion, hypothermia from lying on cold clay for 3 hours. They carried him out on a stretcher and loaded him into the ambulance, and the paramedics worked on him with a quiet efficiency that told me it was serious but survivable. Ruth they did not find. They found the pit. They found the remains of the fire in it, burned down logs and ash, and the charred remnants of the deer carcass we'd used as bait. They found blood on the clay walls of the pit, a lot of blood. And they found what they described as animal hair, coarse and dark, caught in the rough edges of the burned wood. They found Ruth's jacket on the hollow floor, about 40 feet from the pit. They found one of her boots. They did not find Ruth. The team leader, a serious man with a gray mustache and the bearing of someone who had done difficult things for a long time, took me aside and asked me to tell him exactly what had happened. I tried. I told him about the trap, about the thing falling in, about the fire, about Dale falling from the ridge. I told him about Ruth staying behind while I ran for the radio. I told him about the thing coming to the station. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he asked me what kind of animal it was. I said I didn't know. He asked me to describe it. I tried. I said tall, 8 or 9 feet. I said bipedal. I said broad across the shoulders with arms that hung below its knees. I said gray-brown with dark matted hair. I said it made a sound that you felt more than heard. He wrote all of this down in a small notebook, and his face remained professionally neutral throughout. But I could see something in his eyes. Not disbelief exactly, more like a filing away of information into a category he wasn't going to discuss with me right now. They flew me out that night. Helicopter to a hospital in Athens, where they checked me for injuries and found nothing beyond cuts and bruises and a level of psychological shock that the doctor described as consistent with a traumatic event. They kept me overnight. Dale was in the same hospital 2 floors up, in the ICU with a brain bleed that they needed to monitor. I wasn't allowed to see him. The next day, 2 investigators from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources came to my room and asked me to tell the story again. I told it the same way. They had the same neutral expressions as the team leader from the night before. When I was done, one of them said that they had found what appeared to be a large bear's den in the vicinity of the trap site, and that the evidence was consistent with a bear attack. I looked at him and I said it was not a bear. He nodded slowly and wrote something in his notebook. For the purposes of the official report, he said, "We're going to characterize this as a large predator attack, species unconfirmed. I recommend that you don't speak publicly about the specific details of what you saw, for your own credibility and for the ongoing investigation." He said investigation, but what he meant was for our own ability to pretend this didn't happen the way you're saying it did. I understood. I didn't argue. I asked about Ruth. They said the search was ongoing. 7 days later, they called it off. They never found her. Not a body, not remains, not so much as her other boot. She was listed as missing, presumed dead, victim of an animal attack. No species specified. Dale survived. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks with the brain bleed and the broken ribs and the collarbone. When he got out, they transferred him to a desk position in Columbus, the same kind of desk job I had fled 2 months earlier. I heard from a mutual contact that he never talked about what happened, that he refused to discuss it with the investigators beyond confirming the basic facts. 2 rangers were injured in an animal encounter, 1 ranger was killed. He retired 6 months later. I don't know where he went after that. I hope it was somewhere flat and treeless and full of people. I hope he sleeps through the night now. I doubt it, but I hope it. They offered me a transfer and I took it. I'm at a state park now, a popular one, full of campgrounds and picnic shelters and paved trails and families with small children and dogs. It's the kind of place where the most dangerous thing I deal with on a regular basis is a raccoon getting into a dumpster or a teenager trying to bring alcohol into that campground. It's populated and maintained and safe in all the ways that the Wayne National Forest was not. And I should feel better. I should feel safe. Most of the time, I can convince myself that I do. But there are moments. Early morning, when the fog sits low in the creek bottoms and the forest is still and quiet. Late evening, when the shadows between the trees get long and deep and the last hikers have gone home and I'm alone with the woods. Moments when I feel something that might be the pressure starting in my chest, that subsonic thrumming that means something is close and watching. Every time I tell myself it's nothing, every time I tell myself it's psychosomatic, the residue of trauma, my nervous system misfiring, and every time some part of me that is older and wiser than my rational mind tells me to pay attention, to listen, to trust the feeling and leave. I think about Ruth a lot, not just what happened to her, though I think about that too, in the dark hours of the night when sleep won't come. I think about what she said to me on that foggy morning when she first told me about the thing in the hollows. She said it's been in these hills longer than anything human. She said the Adena knew about it. She said the Hopewell people knew about it. Thousands of years of people living alongside something they couldn't explain and couldn't control and couldn't kill. And the best they could do was learn its patterns and avoid it and hope it didn't take an interest in them. And I think about Everett, Ruth's grandmother's uncle, alone in his cabin while the thing circled. 5 nights it came for him before it got in. 5 nights of that pressure and those voices and that patient, methodical testing of the walls. And I wonder if it counted nights with us too. If the voice on my patrol, the trap night, the siege at the station, those were 3 nights, and whether it's still counting. Whether the thing Ruth's grandmother described, patient and ancient and territorial beyond anything we can comprehend, is still aware of me. Whether distance matters to something that has lived in those hills since before human beings built their first mound of earth in the Ohio River Valley. Whether moving 70 miles away is moving at all in the geography of a creature that has existed for millennia. Some nights I hear things outside my apartment. Not the voice, not the mimicry, just sounds, a scraping along the siding, a heaviness in the air that might be the pressure starting again or might be nothing. Might be a raccoon on the roof or a branch against the gutter or the building settling in the cold. I tell myself that every time. And every time I lie awake for hours afterward, listening, waiting. The Wayne National Forest is still there. 240,000 acres of deep hollows and sandstone ridges and second-growth forest covering over the places where people used to live. The trails are still open. The campgrounds still fill up every summer with people who drive down from Columbus and Cincinnati for a weekend in the woods, who pitch their tents and build their campfires and hike into those hollows without knowing what lives there, without feeling the pressure, without hearing the silence. I think about them sometimes and I want to say something. I want to tell someone. But what would I tell them? I'm a park ranger. I found something in the Ohio woods that I can't explain and can't prove and can't name in any official report. Something that has been there since before recorded history, and that takes people. And that cannot be killed, or at least not by us. Not with the tools we had that night. Something that mimics the voices of people you love and uses your own grief and your own longing to draw you out of safety and into its territory. Something that puts out a sound you can't hear, that fills your chest with a dread so total that your body acts against your will. Who do I tell? What do I say? So I don't say anything. I go to work and I check campgrounds and I clear fallen trees from trails. And I write citations for people who let their dogs off leash in sensitive areas. I do my job. And I try not to think about the fact that every forest in Ohio connects to every other forest in Ohio through a network of corridors and greenways and creek bottoms that no one monitors and no one patrols, and no one has mapped in terms of what moves through them at night. I try not to think about the fact that the thing in the Wayne didn't seem bound to the Wayne, that Ruth never said it stayed in one place. She said it was in the hills, and there are hills everywhere in southeastern Ohio. And the hills go on for hundreds of miles, from the Wayne all the way north to the Hocking Hills and beyond. And every mile of them has hollows, and every hollow is deep and dark and quiet in the way that only those hollows are quiet. The specific quiet that means something is there. I try not to think about Ruth singing in the dark. That's the thing that gets me most. When I let it, the sound of her voice in that hollow, calm and even, singing something in a language I didn't understand, while the thing was pulling itself out of the pit and the fire was dying, and Dale was unconscious on the ground. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't running, she was singing. Like she was talking to it, like she was holding its attention, like she was making it listen to her instead of coming after me. I think she saved my life. I think she saved Dale's life. I think she knew exactly what she was doing when she told me to run, and I think she knew that she wasn't going to follow me. And I think about her grandmother telling stories about the thing in the hollows, and her grandmother's Uncle Everett who didn't leave when the calling started. And I wonder if Ruth always knew that the knowledge she carried came with a price. If she always understood that knowing the thing, really knowing it, meant eventually facing it. And I wonder what happened in that hollow after I left. I wonder if the singing worked, if it gave her something, some kind of standing with the thing, some kind of recognition, or if it didn't. If the singing was just a woman's last act of defiance against something that was going to take her regardless. I don't know. I'll never know. They never found her. Last week, I was driving home from work on a 2-lane road that runs along a creek bottom through a stretch of state forest. Not the Wayne, but not far from it. A different unit. Theoretically, a different world. It was dusk. The shadows were long and the fog was just starting to form in the low places, white and thick and hugging the ground. I came around a bend and my headlights swept across the tree line and something was standing there, at the edge of the forest, at the border where the trees stop and the road begins. Tall, still, watching. I saw it for maybe 2 seconds before I was past it and it was behind me in the darkness. 2 seconds. Not enough to see details. Not enough to be sure of what I saw. Just a shape, tall and broad and absolutely still, standing at the tree line like it was waiting. Like it had been waiting for a long time. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove home and I locked my door and I sat in my apartment in the dark and I felt the pressure building in my chest and I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was a shadow, a tree stump, a trick of the light. I told myself all the things that Dale told himself for 3 years before the night it finally came for real. And I know, the same way I knew on my very first day in the Wayne, that something was wrong. The same way I knew when the voice called my name from the hollow that it wasn't Dale. I know that what I saw at the tree line last week was not a shadow. And I know that what I felt in my chest was not psychosomatic. And I know, with a certainty that lives in my body deeper than rational thought can reach, that the thing in the hollows has not forgotten me. That the distance I put between myself and the Wayne National Forest means nothing to something that has been moving through these hills for 10,000 years. That the 3 nights it came for me were not the end of a count but the beginning of one. And that sometime, maybe soon, maybe not, but sometime I am going to hear the voice again. Calling my name from somewhere I can't see, in a voice I recognize, asking me to come. And I don't know if I'll be strong enough not to go. That's the thing that keeps me awake. Not the memory of the creature in the firelight. Not the sound of Ruth singing in the dark. Not even the thought of what happened to her after I left. The thing that keeps me awake is the knowledge that somewhere inside me there is a part that wanted to follow the voice, that wants to follow it still. The same way Dale stepped toward the edge when it called his name. The same way Everett stayed in his cabin instead of leaving. There is something about the thing's call that speaks to a place in you that is older than reason, older than fear, older than the survival instinct itself. A place that wants to go, that wants to answer, that is tired of being afraid and wants to walk into the dark and let whatever is there take the weight of choosing. And I am afraid, more afraid of this than of the creature itself, that one day I will be tired enough to let it. So I do my job. I check campgrounds, I write citations. I go home and I lock my door and I sit in the light, and I do not go to the window when I hear sounds outside. I do not follow the pressure when it starts in my chest. I do not drive through the creek bottoms after dark, and I tell myself that this is enough, that distance and light and other people are enough, that the thing in the hollows is patient but not infinite, that it will find other interests, that it will forget me the way a river forgets a stone it flowed over once. I tell myself this. I do not believe it, but I tell myself this. And the hollows are still there. The Wayne is still there. 240,000 acres of ancient Ohio hill country, folded and deep and quiet in the way that only those hills are quiet. And something in them is still there, and it is patient, and it remembers. And the fog sits in the hollows in the morning like something poured it there, white and thick and heavy, and underneath it the forest is quiet, the specific quiet, the quiet that means it's listening, the quiet that means it knows you're there. And I think sometimes, standing at the edge of the trees at my safe populated state park in the early morning before the families arrive, I think I can feel it, that pressure, that low thrumming vibration below the threshold of hearing, faint and far away but there, like a heartbeat in the earth, like something breathing in the deep hollows, patient, waiting, remembering my name,